Lenin was not very happy about the idea of Bolshevism reduced to the building of God, and there were many polemics that went back and forth at that time. Nevertheless, his friendship with Lenin was solid. His basic loyalty to the Bolsheviks was never in doubt. In 1913, there was an amnesty proclaimed by the Tsar in celebration of the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, little knowing, of course, that he was going to be the last 5 or 6 years of that long-lived dynasty. Gorky took advantage of this amnesty to come back home, where he produced at that time some of his best writing, roughly from 1913 to about 1915 or 16. He wrote a series of autobiographical sketches, which in their collected form gave a powerful picture of his own development as a writer, as well as a tremendously moving account of the 19th century Russia, which he knew very well. His use of the language, both at the literary level and the level of contemporary speech, was absolutely superb. One of the most moving parts of that autobiography is the account of Akulina, the grandmother, this loving grandmother who was illiterate, but who at the same time knew thousands and thousands of verses of Russian folk poetry. But it was not only poetry that she taught him, she also taught him the possibilities of grace and of love. He describes her plain old body, which seemed to him supple and harmonious. When she would do the kind of folk dances that Russian people did, this was something that almost went directly into his soul. When she talked about her faith in the Christian God, particularly in the Madonna, the Mother of God, Gorky was deeply moved. Akulina, the grandmother, pictured the Mother of God as an apple tree in blossom. And of course, these beautiful apple blossoms, which he pictured, gave him a very moving and a very deep sense of the Christian faith as it was experienced in Russia, in the Eastern Orthodox part of the Christian faith. She also introduced him to the beauties of Russian folk poetry, which she astounded everybody when she recited it. She really knew how to appeal to her stubborn grandson. There was a famous poem about Yestigneya, a certain church official. He was stuck into the flames of hell. Сунули его в адское пламя. Ладно ли Yestigнеюшка на мне? Губы у него спесиво надуты, а угарно, говорит, у вас водюты. They stuck him into hell's flames. Well, Yestigneishka, old boy, how do you like our place? He pursed his lips arrogantly, his hands on his hips. Well, he said, it's pretty smoky at your place in hell. You couldn't get a better picture of the young Gorky. She obviously understood his psychology and this kind of stubbornness that even if he were like Yevstyegnishka in hell and the flames and the smoke of hell were in his nostrils, he wouldn't deviate from his path. It's interesting to contrast this to the poetry that his mother tried to get him to learn. He quotes a poem, I believe it's from Tyutchev, a very famous poem in the Russian language. «Большая дорога, прямая дорога, простора немало взяла ты у Бога, тебя не равняли топор и лопата, мягка ты копыту и пылью богата». Large road, straight road, no small amount of space have you taken from God. They haven't put you down with either the axe or the shovel. You're soft to the horse's hoof, and you're full of dust. Gorky tried to remember it, and what came out was «Дорога, двурога, творогни, дорога, копыта, попыта, корыта». Of course, the mother got very angry because what he was saying, road, a two-horned beast, cottage cheese, inexpensive, hoof, some kind of gosh darn priests, and the pig trough. But the rhythm was absolutely perfect, and even the sounds represented what had been done by the famous Russian poet. This shows something about Gorky's talent as a writer, but of course the mother was terribly upset that he couldn't learn the poem that she was trying to get him to learn. Now, in contrast to the warmth of Akulina, the grandmother, and in contrast to the coldness of Varvara, his mother, was one of the most powerful figures in the sketches is grandfather, who's a kind of antithesis to both of these, because his God was the vengeful master of other parts of the Bible. When he threatened with hellfire, there was no charming poetic rhythm. And of course, he was a man who really believed in the old-fashioned kind of discipline. When the kids did something wrong, when Gorky was playing with the dye vats and messed up some cloth, he punished him in a way that was very close to an execution. He put the young man over a piece of wood and hit him repeatedly with a whip. And of course, Gorky describes that scene in a terrible, terrible, painful scene. It's a punishment and a pain which he never forgot. And yet, curiously, the strength it took to overcome the punitive force of that old man was something that became very, very important for his writing later on. And the stories that the old man told him about his experiences previously been a Volga boatman attached by a rope to heavy barges, together with other human beings playing the role of human dray horses. All these things played an enormous role in the formation of Gorky's imagination and force as a writer. As I said before, Gorky left the house at a very early age. Eventually he came back to the house, and there's an unforgettable moment when the young man, by this time already an adolescent, returns to the Kashirin household, the household of his grandfather. He suddenly turns, and as he himself says, unforgivably, that is, butts his grandfather in the stomach. Nastily, to which the old man replies, "Что, козел? Опять бодаться пришел? Эх ты, разбойник! Есть в отца фармазон, Бонапарт цена копейка. Well, you goat, have you come to butt me again? Ech, you bandit, just like your father. You Freemason, you Bonaparte price of a kopeck." It'd be hard to get a better representation of the rhythm of Russian speech in the mouth of a man who entirely unwittingly prepared his grandson to produce some of the best Russian writing, or produce some of the best Russian language of the 20th century. The autobiographical and memoir form gave Gorky a stance which worked extremely well for him, because through his eye, we see powerfully animated characters. Sometimes it gets rather annoying because the eye can never do anything wrong. The eye is always noble. You think after all, God, what a prig of a kid. But at the same time, this eye is observing a whole cast of characters who are totally unforgettable that come before your eyes. And of course, he wanders all the way through Russia, seeing these various characters. This ability to bring these characters to life is especially impressive in his later memoirs of Tolstoy, whom he presents as a human being rather than a literary giant. If you're looking for a picture of Tolstoy the man as opposed to Tolstoy the writer, this memoir is a brilliant way of doing it, and by the way, it has been published in English. His admiration for the man's genius is there, but it's behind a kind of a curtain erected by the picture of the man with all of his foibles. Gorky rather resented it, that Tolstoy looked at him as a representative of the Russian people, as Gorky put it, as perhaps an anthropological specimen of a different kind of a race, a different category of human being. Tolstoy saw him as a representative of something, and of course Gorky didn't consider himself a representative of anything. He considered himself an individual who was Gorky himself. Consequently, we get some glimpses of very powerful and creative Tolstoy. As Gorky says, he holds cards in his hands as if they were birds, and you can virtually hear the birds chirping as Tolstoy is playing cards with him. And of course, when he talks about God, Gorky says, Tolstoy and God were like two bears in the same den. You get a picture of this extraordinarily powerful man who nevertheless could sometimes do things that were totally banal. Now, as a matter of fact, we know from a critic named Shklovsky that Gorky had also heard some tales, either from Tolstoy or about Tolstoy, told by the family, which were hardly complimentary to the old man. There was a story of the time when his daughters came to him with a little hare or a rabbit which had a broken foot. He said, "No, Papa, zaychik, zaychik." The hare had a broken foot, and they were to bring it to her father that he could do something. And according to Shklovsky, Gorky said Tolstoy looked at it with the glance of an experienced hunter and with two fingers strangled the animal before the eyes of his daughter. Of course, this is a very different side of Tolstoy, a very real side of Tolstoy, by the way, but a very different side of Tolstoy, which gives you a sense of the man, both the power and the negative sides of the man, as well as the positive sides. The memoir comes off as a very good presentation, one of the best pictures that we have of Tolstoy as a human being, and its force is typical of the many memoirs by Gorky. In spite of his own tendentiousness as a writer, he gives a very lively picture of Russia on the verge of revolution. Now, Tolstoy, as I say, looked at Gorky as somebody who had strong experience among the people, someone who was representative of the ordinary Russian people whom Tolstoy didn't know, even Tolstoy did not know as well as Gorky. And of course, he tells the story of a woman who came to Gorky, obviously wanting to have very close sexual relations with Gorky. Gorky didn't want to have the woman, and so he turned her around and hit her on the backside with a shovel. And Tolstoy found that very funny. He said, "Oh, you actually hit her with a shovel? That's marvelous." thinking of Tolstoy exulting over a person hitting a woman on the backside with a shovel. And he said to him, well, he said, you're obviously, in Russian uses the word babnik, not a very nice word, a chaser after women. He said, you're not a chaser after women the way I am. You don't understand these things as well as I did. And Gorky said, he didn't have to say that. Lev Tolstoy did not have to say that to me. Tolstoy then said, I'm an even better peasant than you are. Now, of course, Gorky did not like the peasants at all. He considered the peasants very, very backward. He deeply resented the fact that Tolstoy looked at him as a peasant. The dislike that Gorky experienced with Tolstoy, combined with the deep admiration for the genius of Tolstoy, the deep admiration for the writer of the great novels that we talked about before, gave a kind of a rounded picture of a man whom we wouldn't see this way otherwise, who wouldn't see as a human being the way we see him through Gorky's eyes. And of course, this is true of all of the people that Gorky wrote his memoirs about. He wrote some beautiful memoirs about Chekhov, about the Chekhov to whom Tolstoy said, your plays are bad, they're even worse than those of Shakespeare. The Chekhov that Gorky dealt with was a Chekhov who lectured to him, who told him, look, you're a good writer, you're a powerful writer, but you have to learn restraint. You have to learn to hold back. Gorky kind of resented that from Chekhov. He realized, as a matter of fact, that what Chekhov said was true, that he did have to learn the art of restraint. But of course, to be told that by one of the greatest writers in Russia was something that was very hard for him to accept. And of course, he observed Chekhov as Chekhov would see people coming to him. People would come to him for medical consultations and for advice as to what to do with their life. He remembers one particular incident of teachers coming to Chekhov. It turns out that one of these teachers had actually beat one of his students, had actually physically hit one of his students. And of course, this was a very hard thing to accept, that a teacher would actually use violence on one of his students. And they look at this teacher in a way that was not very friendly. And then the teacher begins to explain to Chekhov what kind of a life he has, trying to live on a very, very tiny salary, trying to raise a family in a way that was almost impossible to do given the circumstances under which he lived. The butt of many of the jokes and the mischief of the students he had to deal with, he said, you know, even an angel under those circumstances might turn to violence. And in spite of oneself, you have a certain sympathy for that teacher. You understand why he turned to violence in the classroom. And of course, Gorky used this to talk about the way the society should be changed. The society should be built in such a way that teachers don't have to do this. That teachers should get a decent living. That the students, all students of Russia, should get a decent education from the schools that they go to, not the kind of education that they were exposed to. All of these memoirs give you a sense of why he thought there had to be a revolution in Russia, why he thought there had to be a basic change in the society, why the society that he saw it, in spite of all the warmth that he managed to get into his own text, somehow had to be changed in a basic way to make it possible for all people to live in equality, all people to live with the privileges that it was only the upper classes, with the education, the society would no longer be totally illiterate. These were all things that he saw coming in the revolution. And of course, it's to that revolution that we're going to turn in our next lecture.